In 2018, Nia Wilson would be tragically murdered in an unprovoked attack in Oakland, California. There would be little to no mainstream coverage of her death. Rachel Cargill found this upsetting and took to her Instagram, asking her audience to tag their white feminist friends and leaders, asking them to ally with their black sisters against the tragedy of Nia Wilson's death. Some of these white feminists came out with outrage and surprise that Nia Wilson's death wasn't being covered by the media. However, others got extremely defensive, believing this call for solidarity was a personal attack on them, undermining their accomplishments for the feminist movement. The comment section, filled with sympathy for Nia Wilson's death, would soon be flooded by racial slurs and doxing. Now, why did these white feminists get so offended by a call for solidarity of Nia Wilson's death? In short, the intersectionality of womanhood and race that leads to white feminism and misogynoir, respectively. Let's start with a brief overview of what white feminism is. White feminism tends to refer to two things. One, the exclusion of POCs from the feminist movement, and two, the very specific privilege that white women have comparatively to white men. And this isn't to say that all people who identify as both a woman and white are exclusionary of black women. This is just a term that's used to try to call out white-centered feminism and why that has occurred. White feminism is easy to explain and understand. The feminist movement was created in a system made by and for white people. Therefore, white privilege leads to white women being at the center of said feminist movement. Looking back at the suffrage movement in America, we see white women at the face of it because black women were literally shoved to the back of protests. Even as far back as the rise of the women's rights movement back in the last decades of slavery, we see women like Sojourner Truth declaring that she was not seen as a woman the way white women were. White women's privilege seems a bit harder to understand, though, doesn't it? I mean, you have this weird dichotomy with white women where they possess both an oppressive and oppressed identity. And in an even weirder way, paradoxically, white women can use their womanhood to get ahead in a patriarchal society. I mean, you heard me earlier. I essentially said that white women have privileges that white men don't. Did I seriously mean that? Let me explain. Essentially, the patriarchy functions under the idea that women are pure and fragile beings that need to be protected by men. And while that does lead to a lot of oppression towards women, it also means that certain women can take that fragility associated with them, place themselves as a victim, and the person they feel is attacking them as an enemy. And since the patriarchy is made by and for white people, not black people, those certain women are white women. An example of this can be found in a case study done by Mamta Matwadi Akapati. A group of coworkers were discussing the retention rates of a certain racial group at their university they worked for when Anita, a black woman, commented on the underperformance in terms of racial equity of an office that Sarah, a white woman, ran. And like many white people in this situation, Sarah's ego got in the way. She took it personally, ignored the valid criticism of her office, and instead got upset at Anita that she would imply that she was racist, even though Anita was clearly not implying that. Anita would end up getting reprimanded by her supervisor for having an angry tone with Sarah, despite the fact she initiated a civil discussion with her. Why? Because Sarah would end up crying during the meeting and later reporting her to both of their supervisors. The fact that the meeting shifted to counseling Sarah and no one considered her behavior childish, and the fact that the immediate response of the supervisors was to side with Sarah and consider Anita an angry person, shows how white women can take their fragile victim role in the patriarchy and use it to mark people they deem as against them as attackers. Normally black women. So that's what occurs when you have an identity like a white woman, having the ability to take their womanhood because of their white privilege and shift it into an oppressive identity. Well then, what about the intersectionality of black women? Originally, the term intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, was used to describe the unique experience that a black woman faces. But when more oppressive and privileged identities came out, the term became too generalized, so a new term, coined by Moya Bailey, came out: misogynoir. Misogynoir comes from the patriarchy and the roots of slavery. The patriarchy, among other things, believes that men are entitled to women, and the roots of slavery are founded on the fact that white people believed that black people were less than human, and therefore they were entitled to them as property. So black women face this unique combination of the two identities where they receive hyper entitlement and oppression from white people and men that black men and white women, respectively, do not face. One of the forms that misogynoir can come in is the modern society adaptation of slavery period stereotypes, such as the Jezebel stereotype, which is the idea that black women are sexually promiscuous and constantly desire sex. Originally used for white slave owners to justify the rape of black slaves, it is now used, among other things, to victim blame sexually assaulted black women and for white people to justify their sexualization of black women. There's also the sassy black woman and strong black woman stereotypes, which both have their roots in the mammy stereotype, which was the sort of matriarch slave of the household stereotype who took care of the white family while still being able to be playfully sassy with them. White people's justification for saying that black people like to be enslaved. Obviously, they didn't. Nowadays, it's used to compromise and belittle black women while forcing them to take on their oppression, taking care of their entire family, maybe having a job or like serious mental problems, all without being able to complain, without being mocked. One of the most commonly known stereotypes these days is the angry black woman stereotype, which comes from the sapphire stereotype, which was used during the Jim Crow and slavery era to characterize black women as these angry, unreasonable people who needed to be kept in line. Nowadays, white people use it to A, make themselves look better than their black counterparts, and B, undermine any criticism that black women may have about unjust systems by saying it's an inherent quality that they possess, rather than actually considering her genuine criticism. This stereotype has actually been shown to actively inhibit black women's performance in the workplace. The Harvard Business Review did a study where they asked people to react to a recording of either a black or white woman getting angry in a workplace situation. The 253 adults surveyed were more likely to report that the black woman was being irrational, that her anger was coming from internal rather than external characteristics, and that because of those things, she was going to perform lesser than the white woman. This can also be seen in the number of black women that hold management positions. Hold on, this is a lot to cover, so let me get some caffeine in my system. Okay, so basically, 7% of the American workforce is black women, but Rosalind Brewer and Thashonda Duckett are the only two black women that are Fortune 500 CEOs. This means that they make up less than 0.5% of those CEOs. And considering only 8% of those CEOs are women, Rosalind Brewer and Thashonda Duckett make up 5% of the 41 Fortune 500 CEOs that are women, despite the fact that black women are 15% of women in the workforce. Black women in power don't have it any better. It's been clearly shown in America that wealth and fame do not change people's perception of black women. Take Megan Thee Stallion, for example. She received backlash 2 years back after she reported she was shot in the foot by Tory Lanez. People claiming she was a snitch despite the fact that she was literally assaulted with a firing arm. Black women have so much working against them because of their two oppressed identities. And just like the way white women have a very specific type of privilege because of their whiteness and their womanhood, black women have a very specific type of oppression because of their blackness and their womanhood. In short, the intersectionality of identities of black and white women lead to a very specific kind of oppression known as misogynoir for the former, and a very specific kind of privilege known as white feminism for the latter. Just as white people as a whole need to look internally to see how their white privilege might have benefited them to better themselves, white women must look to see how their supposed fragility of their womanhood might have benefited them. The feminist movement can only be truly equal when there is an explicit inclusion of Black women and other women of color's voices and narratives into the feminist movement. Otherwise, as Rachel Cargle puts it, feminism is just white supremacy in heels. Okay then. Comfy sweater, ambient lighting, freshly brewed coffee placed perfectly in frame, all to give this sense of informality and relatability, despite the fact this is heavily scripted and also filmed in front of a green screen because I couldn't find a comfy area to sit in. Let's get started.